Welcome to Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. We're kicking off a new season of Brainbox with a brand new theme song by the great Oklahoma musician Jeff Moreva. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the long struggle for women to gain the right to vote in America. Our guest is a Brainbox Hall of Famer, Dr. Sunu Kodumthara. She's making her third appearance on the show. Welcome, Sunu.
Thank you.
So glad to have you here. It's a shame listeners can't see this beautiful blazer that we provided you. It's kind of like the Saturday Night Live 5-time host.
That's
right. They get a smoking jacket.
Yeah.
You get a green jacket for winning the Masters.
Be jealous, people.
It's got this beautiful glittery blazer patch with the number 3 on it. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. I've worked hard for this. I appreciate it.
We're so glad to have you here because you're really one of the leading scholars about women's suffrage. So it really is an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
Well, let's start out by talking about kind of the evolution of the suffrage movement. Sure. Going back to the very beginning of the United States, I'm curious, were there any conversations or debates about women's suffrage around, like among the founding fathers or in the very early history of the United States?
So not so much about the founding fathers. I think for them, the primary concern is where do we start? How do we start? What is this going to look like? But there is a conversation that's going on. So that's when I've got to bring up my girl, Abigail Adams. Naturally, I've got to give her a shout out. But so, people like to quote her a lot for her letter to her husband before he went to the Constitutional Convention. And she says to him, "Remember the ladies." Oh. But the thing is we quote that specifically, which is nice because it's dainty and it's nice and, gentlewoman. I don't know. But it's the next sentence that I think really deserves the most attention because she basically says, if you guys don't pay attention to the women, if you don't pay attention to the ladies, she says, we will form a rebellion and we will not be held back by any of the laws you create. We'll fight back. And the reason why I think that quote is so important is because there is always this sense of wanting to be recognized as human beings first, right? It's the humanity of all people. And that's at the heart of every civil rights movement, that as human beings, our voices need to be heard. We need to be validated. That's what the suffrage movement is about, right? And she points to that early on, which is why I think she deserves more attention there, because that particular statement basically says, no matter what you decide to do, we are going to embrace our own voice and we're going to stand up for ourselves and we're going to fight back as much as we can if necessary. Yeah.
So presumably she's not the only woman of the time.
Right. I mean, a part of the problem here is that when we're talking about this time period, it's sporadic. I mean, because so much attention is focused on the revolution, so much attention is focused on, Articles of Confederation or the Constitution, that this topic of women's political equality isn't even on the back burner. It's way, way off somewhere else. And so there are moments where you have individual women or even groups of women who want to come together and have a voice, but it's not something real or tangible until the 1840s.
So when we're talking about the early 19th century beginning of the movement, right, were there some other reform movements or other factors happening at the time that kind of helped the suffrage movement gain momentum?
Yeah. So suffrage is born out of the abolition movement. Oh. And abolition is made up of men and women all campaigning together against slavery.
What time period are we talking?
So we're
here?
talking it really gains momentum in the 1820s and 30s. But by the 1840s, you have an organized movement. And so men and women are coming together. Men and women are writing, they're organizing, they're speaking in public in a general outcry against slavery. But there's a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, something like 1847 or so, where the women were allowed to attend, but they weren't allowed to speak. So you can be seen but not heard. And out of that is born this question of, okay, we've been organizing, we've been speaking, we've been writing. Why don't we why aren't we being recognized as a vital part of this movement? And so that's what brings up the questions of women's equality, right? There's always this underlining debate about where do women belong, even in the abolitionist movement. And that's how we get suffrage. So from that first sort of encounter at the Anti-Slavery Convention, you get the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and all of them sort of step forward as the early leaders of the movement.
Did any of this sort of come out at all of the Jacksonian movement of expanding democracy, expanding the right to vote, or is that kind of a separate?
That's a little bit separate. When we talk about a Jacksonian democracy, it's sort of based on the idea of whiteness and white America, and certainly expansion and land ownership and all of those things. But it's sort of separate. I mean, by the time suffrage really comes out, it's the late 1840s, and it's a movement all on its own. So it's not really tied to any of these larger movements at that point, except for abolition.
So you mentioned the Seneca Falls Convention and
Yes.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah.
Who are some of the, maybe in addition to her, who are some of the key figures in this movement that we should know about?
Well, we have to talk about Susan B. Anthony. If you're going to talk about Stanton, you've got to talk about Susan B. Anthony,
Okay.
or as I call her, Susie B., because she's my close personal friend.
Huh.
So
Is that a Susan B. Anthony tattoo I see poking out from under your? I wondered
how did
about
you
that.
know?
Cool. Okay.
So the two of them have this wonderful dynamic where, Elizabeth Cady Stanton has like 11 children, so she can't leave her home, but she writes a lot. And so Susan B. Anthony takes what Stanton has written and carries the message across the country. And so the two of them work really well together. Of course, at some point, Susan B. Anthony wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and said, "Can you please stop having children? We have suffrage work to do."
She's trying to grow the movement.
Right, she is trying to grow the movement, but but the two of them work so well together, and it's a dynamic that I think carries on into the future. I think it also propels Susan B. Anthony to pick up the mantle. Once Stanton dies, Anthony carries it forward as much as she can, and then she finds others to take it forward. So the two of them work really well off of each other. But there are plenty of women who stand out individually. My personal favorite women's right advocate, I'd have to call her, is Victoria Woodhull. So she's the first woman to own her own brokerage firm. She's the first woman to publish her own weekly newspaper. And she's the first woman to run for president.
Oh, wow.
In 1872.
Wow. Where is she from?
She was born in Ohio, I believe, and she comes from a really struggling background. Like her father was an alcoholic and very abusive. She got a job as like a psychic. She would read palms and that sort of thing. She and her sister worked with some sort of circus. And she got married at the age of 50. So she's got a very difficult life. She deserves her own miniseries at minimum. But she's just a phenomenal person to learn about because she's a great example of a woman who was going to do what she wanted and not make any apologies for it, which is what I think makes people like Stanton and Susan B. Anthony stand out as well. They were going to stand up for their rights regardless of the expectations around them, and it points back towards what Abigail Adams said in 1776. We're going to fight no matter what. We're not making any apologies. We're going to do what we got to do. Those are the standouts for me.
How far outside the norms of female behavior at the time were these women?
Very. Because, like, Susan B. Anthony doesn't get married, Victoria Woodhull would get divorced, and those sort of things are completely outside of expected gender roles. So, the tradition is that a young girl would be trained to be a mother and a wife, and she would go to school, but for limited things that were gender appropriate. And to go outside of that is immediately seen as threatening tradition, going against the Bible or religious values, that sort of thing. And also there is this widely accepted belief that women weren't capable. Women weren't smart enough. They couldn't handle complicated issues. Politics would make their head hurt. There was an actual doctor, and I use air quotes, a doctor who said that if women voted and participated in politics, that it would lead to health concerns, that her brain would, melt. I don't know. So, but there were all of these, claims that women weren't physically or biologically able to handle the pressures of politics. And here are these women going completely against that and doing just fine. So, yeah.
I'm reading a great book right now about George Custer and his wife, who's hugely important in his life. And it made me think about, or taught me a lot about, alternate ways that women exercised political power.
Right. Women, one of the things that I've wanted to study a bit more is how women have shaped the American narrative, whether we're talking about women like Abigail Adams or Eliza Hamilton or George Custer's wife, who creates this whole new memory and legacy for George Custer, right? I think women have always played a pivotal role in how we remember American history, how we learn American history, for the good and the bad, I will say. Because, Jackie Kennedy, for example, will create a type of memory for her husband. So, I mean, that's what women have always been doing. So, yeah, I think it's worth looking into and studying to see what women did to create our collective memory of what American history was and who their husbands were, who their fathers were, that sort of thing. Yeah.
And you mentioned the Seneca Falls. What happened in Seneca Falls? Why is that such a significant
So Seneca
moment?
Falls is really the first time men and women come together specifically for the purpose of talking about women's rights. And so you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton there, but you also have Frederick Douglass there. And Frederick Douglass was a suffragist. His first priority, of course, was to end slavery and help establish Black equality. But he was also a very significant supporter of the suffragist movement. So he was there to and basically this convention, the purpose of the first convention was to discuss what their priorities were in terms of what they wanted to fight for. What are we here for? What do we want? Is it suffrage? Is it economic equality? What does this mean? And so you have all of these prominent leaders from the abolitionist movement coming together to talk about women's rights.
What year did this take place?
This is 1848.
Okay.
Yeah.
So going forward just a little bit from there, through the Civil War, why was the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 such a divisive issue within the suffrage movement?
So I'm sorry to do this, but this does tie back to the Seneca Falls Convention.
Oh, cool.
A little
Perfect.
bit.
There are so many hand gestures happening right now. I wish our listeners could see them. But
I'm so sorry, guys. So what ends up happening is at the convention, there is an issue that comes up about voting for Black people. And Frederick Douglass is one of the attendees who says, listen, our priority needs to be abolishing slavery and establishing political equality and citizenship, of course, for African Americans. He says women's rights are important, but we can only do one thing at a time. So later on, when the issue of voting rights comes up for Black men, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is outraged. She says, you're willing to give former slaves the right to vote, but not your own wives, not your own mothers. And so race plays a huge issue. And it's such a significant moment because it splits the suffrage movement. You have suffragists who are furious that Black men would have the right to vote before white women. And then you have suffragists who say, well, Black men are going to have the vote right now, and eventually we'll get there. We'll use the 14th Amendment. We'll find a way around it. It's a divisive issue for years. And it is one of those things that points to how complicated the suffrage movement really is. Because even carrying into the late 19th century and going into the early 20th, there is always this debate about, okay, well, what's going to happen with the Black women? If women get the right to vote, does that include Black women? And that's a big problem for suffrage leaders. I mean, Susan B. Anthony always hesitates to answer the question. And she says, oh, we'll get to that later. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. And so Black women have to create their own suffrage organizations. They have their own marches, their own protests. And it points to how complicated the suffrage movement really is. Because I think, you know, we have a tendency, especially if you haven't studied it, of course, people aren't going to know, but I think it's important to remember that you can't just take a wide brush and say, oh, the suffrage movement, because it's divided along race lines. It's also divided along class lines, citizenship questions, all of that stuff is involved. And so the 15th Amendment, what it does is it points to this deep divide that will cost the suffrage movement quite a few supporters and even a few years.
And I know some folks in the suffrage movement didn't have the best record on race issues,
right.
or looking back on their views,
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, especially Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because, you know, all of these women have the reputation of being enlightened and progressive and forward thinking. And, oh, you worked with Black people for abolition, you know, what's your problem here? So it is very disappointing. But again, I think if you consider the fact that these are also flawed human beings who are very angry and passionate about this one cause, you know, I think what Stanton's argument is incredibly frustrating. But I think she would put it in the context of, but we were asking for the right to vote and we're white and why doesn't that matter? And, you know, yeah.
And you mentioned Frederick Douglass. Were there other men who played significant roles?
Yeah, so Frederick Douglass is probably the leading Black male voice, but Henry Blackwell is probably the most famous man. He was the husband of Lucy Stone. Lucy Stone's a leading suffragist. There's a guy named James Mott. His wife, Lucretia Mott, she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were at the anti-slavery convention together, and the two of them took a walk in the park, and they were the ones who had the early conversation about women's rights. And so when she came back and told her husband, James was like, oh, we need to do something about this. And so James Mott was actually the one who sort of chaired the Women's Rights Convention in 1848. He was helping to control the discussion. So, yeah, there are some men at the forefront.
There had to be a man chairing that?
No, I think...
Sorry.
Oh, that's a good point, though. We should have that conversation later. Why did a man have to chair it? I think it was really just sort of an opportunity that for men to show their support as allies. And what most of these men do is really sort of step aside and let the women lead the way, but they're there as backup, which I think you and I talked about the first time around with the Me Too movement and how can men be allies and stuff. This is a good model. So they happily sort of stepped aside, and women were able to say what they wanted to say, use the avenues they had available to them, and men followed their lead. Yeah.
So then moving on a little bit further into the 19th century.
Sure.
Why did suffrage take hold in the West? Right.
Okay. First of all, I have to apologize here because I hate the word exceptionalism, and most historians do, but I'm going to say it, exceptionalism. The American West is one of these places where you get to try new things. So people are willing to test things out a little bit. But it's all for different reasons. Like, for example, the first place in the West to grant suffrage is Wyoming Territory. And the reason why they do it is because they want to attract more people to come in and settle there. Because at that point, they had 2 people and a bear. And so, like, how do we get...
There's a separate bear voting rights.
That's right. And so, you know, he had his own suffrage issues. And so if we can attract more people here, have a higher population, we can apply for statehood. So it wasn't like they were super progressive. But it was just, hey, let's just present ourselves as a place trying new things.
What year are we talking?
So that is the late somewhere in the 1870s, I want to say.
Wow,
1860s. Okay. Yeah, late 1860s, early 1870s. Huh. Utah Territory will also pass suffrage as an effort to apply for statehood. But that's rescinded because Congress doesn't like that there are a lot of Mormons there and that the women will, I don't know, it's a whole mess. But
that's a whole different episode.
That's a whole different episode. I'm not ready for that one. Colorado is really the most significant, though. Oh. So Colorado in 1893, already a state, so they don't need the population. They pass women's suffrage. Colorado is, or at that time, going through the populist movement. And the populist movement is really farmer and labor heavy. So a lot of men and women are already leading that movement, and all populists are basically suffragists. And that's what brings in suffrage as a real movement in the West. So, the West is willing to experiment. You've got populists, you've got progressives, and socialists. You can't forget the socialists. And that's what brings about suffrage in the West. Yeah.
But not so much in the East or the South at that time.
No, not so much there. I mean, by the time it gets to New York, most of the American West has some form of equal suffrage. And 1917 is when New York grants equal suffrage. But even then, it's before most of the Eastern region. Oh. So, yeah, everybody else is kind of slow to the... Yeah.
So just for my own ignorance here, this means that women in some Western states could vote for state and local offices?
And presidential elections.
They could vote for presidential elections?
They had full equal suffrage.
Wow.
I know.
Huh.
I mean, don't sleep on the American West, my friend. Leading the way.
So I've been on the edge of my seat to bring up this next topic because I know it's one that you are passionate about.
Oh, jeez.
Can we talk about some of the anti-suffrage movements? These are some interesting folks.
These are fun people.
And they're not all guys either.
No. Most of them are women.
Most of them?
Yeah. The organized anti-suffrage movements and associations are led by women.
Wow.
And these are wives of prominent people, wives of senators, judges, people who have money. And what they're fearful of in terms of suffrage is that it would create an economic equality that they're not ready for. Like, for example, the idea that a working class woman, or worst of all, a prostitute, would have the same say at the polling place as the wife of a senator was completely offensive, and they didn't want to deal with that. And so you have and it's entirely reactionary, right? I mean, once Colorado passes equal suffrage laws, that's when you start to see an organized anti-suffrage movement, because they're like, oh God, it's getting out of control. A state has passed equal suffrage. How do we react? And it grows from there. By 1911, you have a national anti-suffrage association, and it expands from there. It's all sort of based out of New York, but there are other state organizations as well. The New York one, though, is the funniest because in 1911 you have the national organization. 1917 New York grants equal suffrage, and if I'm an anti-suffragist in New York and I have the right to vote, what am I going to do? So what they do is typical of what a lot of anti-suffragists, they vote. And they'll say, oh, I hate voting, but it is my responsibility.
So inconvenient.
It's so inconvenient, but I guess I'll do it.
Huh.
And that's what they do. And they vote primarily to outvote the bad people. In fact, that's what they say. We need to get out the good vote.
Okay.
So that the bad vote doesn't win. It's so bizarre and yet fantastical in every possible way.
So the women who were leading the anti-suffragist movement, they weren't just figureheads they were legitimately at the forefront of this.
They were organizing, speaking, publishing newspapers. I'll send you articles of what these women are doing.
We can post some of these on our website we'll do a webpage about this episode.
Because I don't think people would believe it until they actually saw it. But they're testifying before Congress, for crying out loud. And yet, at the same time, they'll argue, listen, Politics is too complicated. Women don't have time to organize. Women don't have time to speak. Women don't have time to campaign. And yet that's what y'all are doing. So it's so bizarre.
It's hard to wrap your mind around it.
It really is. And my favorite story, and I think I definitely want to send this to you. My favorite story is about one woman who was the president of the National Anti-Suffrage Association. And so the New York Times paid a visit to her office. So they went to the building, and one side of the office was for anti-suffrage purposes, but the other side was for the newly established political party she was leading called the National Anti-Suffrage Party. And you could register to vote there.
Staffed entirely by men?
By women. They were encouraging women to vote.
Wow.
Nothing makes sense. And that's why I love them. Yeah.
This is your area of, sort of one of your areas of expertise,
This
right?
is what I like to do, yeah. My advisor once told me, because I was going to focus primarily on suffragists, but I had kept mentioning these anti-suffragists, and he was like, Sunu, I know what the good guys do, but I want to know about these people. I want to know about the losers. And I said, okay. And that's how a history career is born.
I did want to ask you about kind of what was happening in Oklahoma, in Indian Territory in Oklahoma, regarding suffrage. And you've written an article for a forthcoming magazine, our Oklahoma Humanities magazine, about a prominent woman in Oklahoma named Edith Cherry Johnson. Yeah. And sort of her journey from being an anti-suffragist to being an activist for suffrage. Yeah,
but she does it in her own way, which is what makes her really interesting. So initially, this is a woman who writes a weekly column. She does not get married, by the way. She never gets married. She never has children. But she
writes a column for the Oklahoman.
Writes a weekly column for the Daily Oklahoman.
Starting like before statehood even, right?
Yes, yeah. Okay. Pretty early on, actually. Okay. And so in her article, she would talk about relationships, how women are supposed to behave, how men are supposed to behave, what kind of man a woman should marry. She described them as a plain man. So someone boring. Get you someone boring. So she spends a lot of time talking about that. And then World War I happens. And once the war happens, she's frustrated that suffragists still want to campaign for the right to vote while there's a war going on. She even says, look, shouldn't we prioritize the war effort? Why are you guys still bothering us about the vote? Then the war is over. And by then, Woodrow Wilson has written a letter to the Oklahoma State Legislature saying, hey, listen, I was against it, but I'm for it now. Y'all should think about it. And the state legislature passes it. And she says, okay, well, if it's happening, let's see what goes on. And it starts to dawn on her, wait a second, I think women could do this. And I think women could really contribute to the improvement of our society. Now, granted, she's putting all the weight of, morality and political responsibility and ethics all squarely on the shoulders of women.
Which was part of her argument against suffrage in the first place, right?
Right. I mean, initially, and not just her, most anti-suffragists would say, listen, women are responsible for the home, they have to raise the children, and they've got to create good citizens there.
They almost have like a higher responsibility than men.
Exactly. That because God has put them in this place, that they have almost a spiritual destiny to be the spiritual leaders of their home. And that's the primary argument against women voting. And then once it's passed in Oklahoma, Johnson says, well, wait a second. What if they take that spiritual responsibility and apply it to the state? What if we can fix the immorality? What if we can clean up our streets? What if we can do all of this amazing things thanks to women voting? It doesn't always work in her favor because she says, well, I hear a lot of women talking trash. I don't like it. It's inappropriate. Don't be like the men. But it's still, but she says, I think this works. I think this is the way that we've got to go now. And there's a significant change of heart for her.
Do you think that was mirrored in other people, or like kind of a national conversation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just to get back into the whole idea of how complicated suffrage is, there are women who want the right to vote like Susan B. Anthony. They want the right to vote because we are human beings, we have a voice, we want to be heard, we can contribute. But then there are other women who will make the argument of we are moral leaders, we are good people, we can help improve our society, we can protect our children better, so that's why we should have the right to vote. It's all about strategy. In the end, the latter strategy, the moral leaders, that's what wins out. If you were to look at the state level and the different state movements versus the national movement's always talking about equality. But it's the state movements that are saying, hey, listen, we see all the corruption in our local politics. We see our children drinking dirty milk. We should have a larger voice to protect our families, to protect our communities. Who better than women to do it? And that's how they win the right to vote there. Huh. Yeah.
Were there some other differences or controversies between what you might call moderate voices in the movement versus radical voices in the movement?
Sure. So I'm currently reading The Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss, which I would strongly recommend. It's quite a book in terms of you've got to give yourself a minute. But she gets into it. She gets into it even early on because she's talking about the ratification process at Tennessee, the debate, the debate for ratification there. And you have all of these people coming to Tennessee to debate, to try to sway legislatures one way or another. So anti-suffragists show up, but so does Carrie Chapman Catt, who is the appointed leader of the suffrage movement, appointed by Susan B. Anthony herself. And then there's Alice Paul. And Alice Paul and Catt, these two women disagree early on because Paul is seen as a radical. She's not satisfied with suffrage. She wants more than that. She wants equality on every level, and she wants it right now. So there is a strategic difference between the two because the moderates are just going to focus on suffrage and say, okay, once we get suffrage, then we can move on. We can vote women into office. They can shape the legislation, and we can go from there. Alice Paul wants everything right now. And so she is much more radical in her approach. Her strategies are going to be different. Her rhetoric is going to be a little bit more radical. And that sets a new trend going into the future because now the question is strategy. What do we want and how are we going to get it? So as the suffrage movement comes close to its end, you start to see the emergence of this new divide of, okay, what's next? And how are we going to achieve those things?
So what was happening around the time of, how did it finally get passed in, was it 1919, 1920?
So ratification happens in 1920. By the time Congress passes legislation, it's pretty clear. The trend is equal suffrage. But ratification is a completely different battle. And in a lot of ways, it's probably the most significant battle because then you're getting into, or you start to see debates on things like states' rights. When Oklahoma was debating on whether or not to ratify the amendment, there were people on both sides of the aisle both sides of the argument who basically said, we have a responsibility to the country to show how great women's suffrage has been. We should vote yes. And on the other side, there were people who were saying, but this is the federal government exerting its control over states and telling us what to do. And then in the South, of course, there is the argument of, well, if women have to vote, then they're going to make us allow black women to vote, which is a ridiculous argument because they already weren't allowing black men to vote. So I don't know if they thought we weren't aware of that, but so it's this idea of, well, race is going to be a big problem here. We hated the 15th. Now they're going to put the 19th on us. It is a struggle to get these states to ratify. Ratification is a long, complicated process. So by the time it gets to Tennessee being the 36th state to ratify, it's by one vote.
Wow.
Yeah, it's by one vote, and it's because the dude gets a telegram from his mom. That's the story. The I think he was a state senator, but he got a telegram from his mom, and his mom said, "I really hope you make the right decision."
Guilt from the mom.
Pork chops for dinner. See you later. Just this really sort of subtle statement, like,
wow.
Don't mess this up. And so, and that's how we get the suffrage amendment.
Were there other things happening in the 19-teens that sort of laid the groundwork, just in a larger cultural sense?
Sure. There's a combination of things. So the progressive movement is a big deal. So from 1900 to 1920, I would say, you have the progressive movement. It's this large reform-minded movement. Everything's got to change. We've got to fix things. We've got to improve things. We've got to save people. And in the middle of that is this argument that, listen, if we're going to change things and save people and fix all of the corruption and the greed, who better to do it than women? And so the progressive movement gives suffrage a big boost. So by then, 1911, California grants the right to vote. Washington does in 1910. And so the progressive movement really carries a lot of momentum nationally anyway. But in some areas, women's suffrage feel the strong benefit of that. And then, of course, World War I. So World War I puts women at the forefront of things in that women were organizing, volunteering for the Red Cross, serving wherever they could. And it brings to a lot of people's attention the idea that women really do contribute, and it seems a problem to deny them this basic right because they're women. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, who was never going to pay any attention to women's suffrage, regardless of how many women protested in front of the White House, because of the war, he changes his mind. Huh. So those two large events really changed the game here. Huh. Yeah. I've got to say, the World War I thing, since Justin Olmsted's interview with you, when was that, like a year ago, about World War I?
Yeah, it was the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I.
That conversation completely changed the game for me. And what ended up happening was I started to think about all of the different ways World War I had an impact on American society. And of course, that one's huge on women and women's activism and how it shines a light on women's contributions. That was really significant.
That's a really good episode, and I love what he said in it. Shout out to Justin Olmsted at the University of Central Oklahoma.
Yeah.
He likes to say everything leads to and from the First World War.
It's true, and I angrily told him when I met him a couple months ago that I was mad at him. I had to change my entire lecture about World War I. And yesterday, when I first met my freshmen for this semester, I said to them, guys, I can't believe I'm saying this, but World War I's a big deal. We got to focus a lot on World War I. And that's so shout out to Justin Olmsted, but with a little bit of, anger.
It is. I thought it was fascinating in your article about Edith Cherry Johnson, the Oklahoman who started out as an anti-suffragist. Her argument during World War I, not only her argument was like, don't talk about this during the war.
Yes.
Go back on the back burner.
That's right. I mean, so one of her biggest issues is, listen, the world is literally at war. We have to focus all of our energy there. Isn't that the most important thing? And it's not just, right, it's a national anti-suffragist argument. And she hated that there were women who had the audacity to demand suffrage in the middle of all of that, right? She hates that there were women protesting outside of the White House. She was angry that Jeanette Rankin, who was the only woman in Congress at that time, voted against the war. She thought it was unpatriotic, anti-American. She could be socialist. I mean, Johnson had a huge problem with that because she thought it was disloyal and selfish. And that's especially problematic when we're talking about women, that women shouldn't be that selfish. Women shouldn't be self-serving in that way. You should, put all your focus on the country and what our country needs right now. And then it turns out that because women were serving and were contributing, that's actually the game changer for a lot of people like her.
I guess you see that in a lot of protest movements where there are always voices saying it's not time. Don't talk about it right now.
Yes.
There'll be another time later.
Sometime later. And my favorite part of that is, okay, when? Like, can we pick a date on the calendar? It's actually John F. Kennedy who makes a comment about that with civil rights, for example. He gives that great speech in 1963. But it's something to remember for all of these different movements. If we're not going to talk about it right now, when will it be more convenient for you?
Right.
Because the reality is women's suffrage and women's equality and feminism in general is not a comfortable topic. It's going to challenge a traditional way of thinking, especially if you come from a conservative background.
Your whole identity is wrapped up in
and so it's never going to be comfortable and it's never going to be easy. So if that's the case, well, we might as well get it out of the way. That's I think what the big issue there was.
So it takes almost 100 years to achieve the right to vote for
That's
women.
All.
Then we have the 1920 election, the year that the 19th Amendment was passed. Did millions of women having the right to vote affect the 1920 election right away?
So, okay, here's what happened. So then by 1920, we have our first presidential election where everybody can vote, and it turns out that not that many women voted. And so there are a lot of historians who, don't pay attention to context and will just say, see, women weren't voting. In fact, I heard that. I don't think I told you this. A few years ago, a colleague of mine actually made that comment. It didn't matter because women didn't even vote in the 1920 election. And I would like to just praise myself for not physically assaulting this particular individual, because the context is this. By 1920, nobody's voting. In fact, at that point, it had the lowest voter turnout in American history. So a lot of it is because historians use this phrase moral fatigue, which literally means people were tired of doing the right thing. And so they didn't care anymore.
I get that a lot. It happens to me a lot.
See, I'm so sick of being the good guy. And then, there's, of course, Warren G. Harding and the Republican Party who use the phrase return to normalcy, the idea that let's just leave politics to the politicians. Citizens can go back to doing whatever they wanted, which is how we end up with a Warren G. Harding.
This is like after all the upheavals of World War I and the progressive movement.
Exactly. And so at that point, people are just like, I don't want to be good people anymore, and I don't want to fix things anymore. How about we take a break? And that's how you get Warren G. Harding and all of his Warren G. Hardingness.
So women didn't play a significant role?
Not as much as people thought, and not as much as people said they would. But it does get to this point. Well, one, like I said, no one's voting in that election. Two, it does point out to the fact that women really weren't these great moral leaders. Women are just human beings. And sometimes women didn't feel like voting. I mean, it's okay, right? So it points to their humanity, right? That they just wanted the voice, and they wanted the opportunity to be able to exercise that voice without fear of being put in prison or being ridiculed, that sort of thing. So, I realize they didn't vote a lot, and who's going to vote for Warren G. Harding?
I have to say, this runs contrary to the argument or to the lessons that I learned in high school. This was in the 1990s. My American history teacher claimed that it was women who were responsible for the election of Warren G. Harding, perhaps the most corrupt and worthless president. Because his argument was because Warren G. Harding was the more handsome candidate, and that he thought women voters.
I've seen photographs.
Have you not seen Warren G. Harding? Breathtaking.
I know. I have his poster up on my wall. Listen.
That's not legit.
Oh, isn't it so nice to go with the easier argument? Warren G. Harding, no. First of all, no. And also, the other thing is this. Harding benefited from a political system of good old boys who really put him there. It's not like this guy was really wanting to be president. He had some good friends who put him up. And, that leads to the corruption aspect of Harding's administration. This dude was so messed up. That's a separate episode.
Yeah. Let's do one about the teapot dome scandal later on.
We've do it, yeah.
But it's so you've turned my whole view of American history around. We can't blame women for the election of Warren Harding.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Shout out to my history teacher, Mr. Lepper, in the early 1990s. Okay.
Where's that guy? Let's go find that guy. And let's have him say it in person. Okay. Oh, God bless. Jeez. Okay. Okay.
So let's talk about how did the suffrage movement, and maybe in some ways the anti-suffrage movement, become a stepping stone to the feminist movement of the later 20th century?
In a lot of ways. It's an easy transition, right? Because after suffrage is ratified, there is this conversation of what's next. Okay, where do we go from here? Because there are plenty of women like Emma Goldman and European feminists or European women's rights activists who argue that suffrage isn't going to get them anything. Emma Goldman argues that by gaining suffrage, you're actually only voting into a corrupt system. So the way that you really gain equality is through economics. If you earn the money, you gain power. That's how you gain real influence, and that's how you can change the system. So after suffrage is ratified, the question is, okay, what do we need now? And that's where Alice Paul factors in. And Paul says, suffrage is great. It's a good step, but it's not the final step. What we really want is equal rights in writing in the Constitution, and that's where you get the organized fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, which is, we are still waiting on that. But anti-suffragists will make the same sort of transition. We are now not anti-suffrage because we actually exercise the right to suffrage. So instead, we will be anti-feminist. Oh. And this is what...
The same folks, just different... Same team, just different jerseys.
That's exactly right. New jerseys. And so... New Jersey? Okay.
Sorry.
So now... as they transition out of anti-suffrage into anti-feminism, you start to see the foundation for women like Phyllis Schlafly and others like her who are going to campaign in the 1960s and the 1970s about the appropriate place for women, that women need to be in the home, even though Phyllis Schlafly was not. And so it links right into it. It's almost a really easy transition into a more modern movement.
Were there even some lessons they took from the tactics of the anti-suffragist movement?
Very much so. So the anti-feminists are really going to pick up on the strategy of the suffragists. What worked for suffrage, and how do we make it work for us? And what they took was suffrage really found its success at the ground level, organizing among women in local communities, talking to our neighbors, talking with our, book reading clubs, whatever, and then getting the word out. That's what Phyllis Schlafly's strength really was, is that she met with women locally and started to build from there. So she had a really, really strong grassroots movement going on, as she made her way to the national stage. And she was, there are film clips of her, giving advice and strategy to these women who, I don't know, stayed late after church. I don't know what they were doing, but these are all regular women, and a lot of them are housewives, and she gives them tools, she gives them things that they need to say, and she organizes them so well that that's what really stops the momentum for the Equal Rights Amendment. Yeah. Because before her, both Republicans and Democrats are supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment, both parties. And then she shows up, and that's when you start to see the change. Yeah. So
thinking back about the 1920 election and women's role that they may or may not have played there, if we look at the 100 years since women have had the right to vote, are there some ways that women having the right to vote have changed American culture and democracy?
Sure, I think so. I think when we start to see the issues of economic equality, for example, and we talk about the issues of equal pay or things like sexual harassment in the workplace, Title IX, all of those things I think carry heavy are a result of the influence of women political leaders, but also leaders of different organizations and that sort of thing. I just think that there is still more to do, but there's a lack of women in that space to really push it forward. I mean, only in 2018 did we really see an emergence of a large number of women start to step up and serve in a political way as political leaders. But it's not nearly at the level that I think we could be.
Yeah, you pointed out to me shortly before we recorded this that it was January 2019 that a woman was inaugurated as the Speaker of the House in Virginia for the first time.
Yes, for the first time in 400 years.
Virginia's been around a while.
I know. 400 years. What is that about? But again, you know, there are plenty of people out there. Like, for example, you know, the Oscar nominations came out and there are no women directors nominated for Best Director.
Little Women was a pretty good movie.
I know. And I read a lot of comments that said, well, that's because they're not as good as the men. And so then after throwing my phone up against the wall, what I realized is, you know, even now in the 21st century, there is still a very real fight against gender perceptions and what are acceptable roles, what can women do versus what men can do, and that sort of thing. So there is this struggle to really prove that women can serve, that women can lead, and that women have vision and can direct people and can handle the pressures of it, you know, even in the 21st century.
Yeah, I remember in 2016, I was having a conversation with my 5-year-old daughter, and it came up that, a woman has never been the president of the United States. The United States has been around for 230-some years.
Right.
And she was like, as a 5-year-old, she was like, that doesn't seem right. That's kind of, I don't know. Is that right?
Yeah. But I think we've talked about how your daughter should probably run for office at some point, haven't we?
Shout out. Well, that's why we chose her name, actually. We thought President Jane Carroll seems kind of, that sounds realistic. Yeah. Put
the stickers together, get a phrase going. I'm on it. Yeah. That's good. No, I think she was right.
What will it take for a woman finally to be elected president, do you think?
Chris, I don't know.
We've got another hour to talk about this.
Oh, your poor listeners. I really don't know. And the irony is that, you know, America we do like to present ourselves as, I don't know, forward, progressive thinking, leading the way for democracy and all of that stuff.
A model for the rest of the world.
That's right. And we, you know, there was one black dude who became president and then we're done. Now suddenly, okay, we're good. We'll just wait another...
Give it another 100 years.
Yeah, it'll be fine. I mean, it's just, the expectations are different. The rules are different, I think. You know, in the 2016 campaign, there was a lot of talk about whether or not a woman had the emotional capacity to handle the stresses of office. And yes, I mean, why is this even a conversation? So, you know, you ask a good question, but I don't have the answer to that. I'm so sorry.
Let's end on that note. Okay. The note of uncertainty.
Right.
That leaves the door open for the next appearance by Dr. Sunu Kodumthara. Your fourth appearance. Maybe we'll be looking back on this. But thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you, guys.
Is there anything you'd like to plug? Any projects you have going on in 2020?
Oh my God!
You're doing a few speaking appearances this year.
I'm doing a few speaking. The suffrage centennial has put me to work, my friend. I will be everywhere.
Speaking of women seeking economic,
I was not ready
a hot
for
topic.
that. I know. I didn't realize that until the end. Towards the end of last year, I was like, "Wait a second, this is actually working out really well for me, just in time for me to apply for promotion." So this is great. It's all good.
We
guys.
see you working.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Really glad to have you on the show.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, and listeners can check out our website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about some of the topics we discussed in this episode. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using #BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our great new theme music was composed by Jeff Moreva. And we always have to say, this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in this podcast by Dr. Sunu Kodumthara or myself do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.